Welcome to the online roundtable discussion on gender, war, and memory, the Baltic States and Ukraine. My name is Jörg Hackmann. I'm the president of the Association for the Advancement of Baltic Studies and professor of history at Szczecin University. AABS started to organize webinars on Baltic Ukrainian topics after the full-scale invasion of Russia into Ukraine in 2022. Today's discussion will explore the intersection of gender, war, and memory, which often implies that women are studied primarily as the victims of war and other traumatic incidents. The goal of this discussion is to challenge this trend by analyzing narratives and depictions of the traumatic experiences of women in several wars, including World War II and Russia's ongoing war against Ukraine. The main questions will be: how do women who were or are engaged in war depict their roles as related to violence and the traumatic experience of torture and deportation? How do they cope with traumatic memories? Are those memories transformed into empowerment through political activities? What is their relationship with the national and transnational war narratives in the Baltic States and Ukraine? These and other questions will be tackled by our very distinguished panel, consisting of Dina Eglitis. She is Associate Professor of Sociology and International Affairs at George Washington University in Washington, D.C., and currently the president-elect of AABS. Her work focuses on collective memory, socioeconomic inequality, and gender in the Baltic region. Marta Havriško is a visiting assistant professor in Holocaust pedagogy and anti-Semitism studies at the Strasser Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Clark University. Currently, she is researching sexual violence during the Holocaust in Ukraine. Janet Johnson is the endowed chair in Women's and Gender Studies and professor of political science, Brooklyn Community College, and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. Her books include The Gender of Informal Politics, Russia, Iceland, and 21st Century Male Dominance. Mara Lazda is a professor of history at Bronx Community College, City University of New York. Her research on gender, nationalism, and transnationalism focuses on Latvia. The webinar will be moderated by Grażyna Bielusova. She is a postdoctoral scholar at the Institute of International Relations and Political Science, Vilnius University, and a researcher at Vytautas Magnus University in Kaunas. She is currently working on a book, What's Left of Feminism in East Europe. Please be aware that the chat function during this webinar is disabled, but we welcome your questions during using the Q&A button. And I now hand over to Grażyna, the moderator of today's discussion.
Good morning or good evening, depending on where you're joining us. It is my distinct pleasure to be moderating this panel with women that I myself admire. And I would also like to draw our attention to the fact that while we are going to be specifically talking about East Europe, women, violence, war, and other realities that we are going to be addressing today and the way that we remember them are not located just in this region, but also I think everybody's minds are now on the Levant, on Israel, Palestine, and Lebanon. So as we are continuing this conversation, keep that in mind as well. The first speaker for today is Dina Eglitis, who is going to share with us on Soviet liberator violence against Jewish women survivors of Nazi camps, and looking also at how this violence occurred during the death marches. So Dina, would you please share? And I will remind that our time is unfortunately only 5 minutes.
Thank you, Grażyna, for the introduction. Since I only have 5 minutes, I shall begin immediately. So much of my recent work has been focused on the goal of bringing women's voices to the telling of historical narratives. It's an effort to center women's experiences and memories and to ask the question, what does history look like when constructed from women's perspectives? When knowledge of the past is constructed almost exclusively from male perspectives, it's incomplete because the standpoint of women is marginalized or silenced. Let me give you an example. Consider what you know about Allied liberation of Nazi concentration camps at or near the end of World War II. Liberation was, without question, an important and much awaited end to the fear, hunger, and mortal danger of every single day in a Nazi camp. Our mainstream histories of this period recognize liberation as a culmination of heroism and a triumph of good over evil. But what if this is history that illuminates some actors and events, but obscures others? What if this history is more nuanced and complicated than it appears? My research, recently published in the Journal of Holocaust Research, revisits the story of liberation of the Eastern camps using testimonies and memoirs of Jewish women survivors. It documents Jewish women's experiences of violence, including sexual violence, at liberation. These stories of liberator violence are present in primary sources, but they've been largely excluded from dominant accounts of liberation. In the liberated camps of the East, including those in Poland, Soviet liberators engaged in sexual violence, sexual abuse of survivors. By drawing women's voices into the history of liberation, we expand the story, but at the same time, the smooth, unproblematic telling of a heroic, male-centered history is disrupted. In testimonies and memoirs, women survivors tell their own stories, and sometimes they tell the stories of other women who didn't survive. Mally Kay, a Latvian-born survivor, remembers that after liberation, quote, there were a lot of Jewish women from the camps who couldn't communicate with the Soviet liberators, and they were raped. It was tragic to see their story. 2 of our girls from Liepaja tried to hide in a lavatory, and the soldiers shot them through the doors, unquote. Women's voices contribute to a history of liberation that highlights particular characteristics of Soviet liberation of camps and death marches, which I'll summarize very briefly. First, they show that Jewish survivors, both women and men, were regarded by Soviet liberators with suspicion. Many were suspected of collaboration with their Nazi captors. From the Soviet perspective, survival itself, an anomaly in genocidal conditions, functioned as tacit evidence of complicity. From the patriarchally shaped male perspective, women's suspected collaboration was often perceived as sexual collaboration, amplifying women's vulnerability to the violence of the liberators. Riva D., a Jewish survivor from the borderland of Poland and Lithuania, recalls that she was one of a group of 15 young women. Soviet soldiers, she says, were sexually assaulting the women and telling them that they were, quote, left alive because they were living with Germans, unquote. Second, women's stories suggest that Soviet liberator rape was also linked to a sense of entitlement on the part of troops who had freed the prisoners. In the words of a Czechoslovakian-born survivor liberated out of Stutthof camp, quote, I freed you and you are mine. I can do anything I want with you. I gave you life, unquote. Third, and finally, rape was perceived by some victims as a product of an unfulfilled sexual, quote unquote, need of which troops at the front had been deprived. In this instance, some women adopted, arguably, a dominant male point of view, echoing a sentiment that would explain, though certainly not justify, the violence they experienced and witnessed. German-born survivor Helma T., who was assaulted by Soviet troops at liberation, remembers, quote, the Russians freed us, but that's what they did to a lot of girls afterwards. I don't know how long they didn't see women or whatever, unquote. To wrap up then, women's voices matter. Women's standpoints offer us vital and long obscured angles on history. Survivor Gerda G. says in her testimony, quote, this is why I say women's experiences were different than those of men. We had to hide, afraid to be raped. That was our liberation, unquote. The story of liberation as told from women's perspectives is not quite the same as that told from the male perspective, or even from the liberator perspective. It forces us as writers and consumers of history to reshuffle roles like hero, not least because we see in the testimonies that stories of women helping women at war's end are much more prominent than men helping women. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dinah. It's as illuminating and revealing as it is disturbing. I would just like to give note to those who may be listening that if this is hitting you hard and you cannot take it at this moment, we are recording and you can come back to this material at a later time as well. Because we are continuing with another hard-hitting story from Marta Havryshka, who is going to talk about female rape survivors who were also Holocaust survivors, and particular about their agency in seeking justice after World War II in the Soviet Union in terms of war crimes trials. Marta, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Grażyna. So today I want to talk about Holocaust survivors who were themselves also rape survivors and survivors of sexual violence during the Holocaust, who exercised their agency after the Second World War in the Soviet Union. My focus is post-war Soviet Ukraine and Ukraine Jewish women who approached security service, who approached Soviet officials and asked them to persecute mostly their neighbors. Former classmates, former heads of collective farms, former party members, and some of them were decorated war veterans, because many former collaborators, for example, when Red Army approached Ukrainian lands, they joined Red Army, and some of them were liberated Berlin and Germany. Some of them were highly decorated. They received medals, they received social status. But Jewish women remembered what they did to them during the Holocaust. So those Jewish women approached Soviet agencies in order to hold them accountable. And here we see how they are struggling to get this justice and how many obstacles they face. First of all, some state prosecutors do not believe them. So the first obstacle is distrust. Soviet officials were really they wanted to persecute only those high-rank perpetrators, Ukraine perpetrators, especially if they were members of Ukraine nationalists underground. So the picture of rape really fit this image of brutal Ukraine bourgeois nationalists who collaborated with Nazis. That's why they were interested only in those precise stories and only in those precise rape survivors, not in all rape survivors. That's why, for example, Raisa from Novopavlivka in Odessa Oblast, who was raped by her class school fellow when she was 13 and he was 18, never got justice. She was trying to convince them that she was raped, that it was the situation of extreme imbalance of power, that she was threatened by a gun. But instead, those who were involved in this persecution actually applied their rape myth and their images of perfect victim. She was asked why nobody saw her torn body, torn clothes, why nobody heard her resistance, her screaming. That's why she wasn't believed, actually. And her story is very revealing in this regard, in the whole process of seeking justice by many survivors of sexual violence. And it's very complicated in these political circumstances when women, Holocaust survivors, were afraid to be blamed for so-called horizontal collaboration. They were really afraid for the question, how did you survive actually? Maybe you use your body as a survival tool, and in these circumstances, it was really viewed as a guilt of those women. That's why those stories are very important to investigate, and they are very important to be included in the broader picture of women's agency and women's victimization during the Holocaust and after the Holocaust and the end of the World War II. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marta. I would now like to turn to Janet and Mara, who engaged in joint research in Riga this last summer of 2024. And I would like to ask them to reflect on how they conceptualize their work with people who were traumatized and who experienced war, and what it means for their organizations and the individuals that they interviewed. And I believe we are going to hear from Janet first, followed by Mara.
So I am going to bring us up to the contemporary day. We're kind of time shifting from World War II to Russia's current war against Ukraine, which started at least in 2014, but became much more prominent in 2022. And since that escalation in 2022, there's been remarkable international attention by mainstream media, social media, international leaders on the gendered nature of the war and its particular impact on women, which I think indicates a real difference from the Second World War. And we may recall stories of women volunteering for Ukrainian forces, but also reports of sexual violence, human trafficking, and the challenges of getting reproductive care, especially in places like Poland, where abortion is not allowed. According to the OECD, women make up some 70% of Ukrainian refugees. And the media also reported on a range of feminist responses among those in Ukraine, but also the Russian feminist anti-war resistance who had spokespersons outside of Russia, including in the Baltics. Mara and I conducted fieldwork in Riga in July this last summer with the hopes of understanding and documenting the feminist support of Ukrainian refugees in Latvia and of women in Ukraine. Latvia receives some 400,000 refugees, which is a lot in a country that has a population that is not that large. We were curious about two sets of questions. First, to what extent was the refugee support in Latvia feminist? And was this feminist support connected to feminist solidarity? In other words, were Latvian feminist groups working well together, but also were they, more than 2 years after the full-scale invasion, connecting to Ukrainian feminist groups? Second, we were interested in whether this feminist solidarity had fostered transnational and transethnic solidarity. Most of you are Baltic experts and know that there's a substantial Russian ethnic and Russian-speaking community already living in Latvia as a result of Russian and Soviet imperialism. And we were wondering whether the feminist work against the war had changed the relationship between Russian communities and the rest of Latvian society, and specifically, were there any connections to the anti-war feminists who had fled Russia in after 2022? We met with staff of 3 feminist organizations in Latvia, 4 organizations that did not identify as feminists, but have been helping Ukrainian women refugees, 2 policymakers associated with the Latvian government's support of Ukrainian women, and 2 Russian dissidents with feminist connections. And we soaked and poked, observing organizational activities, relationships, and the use of language and life on the street. In the process, we saw the Latvian government was also engaging in responding to the gender dynamics of the war. So we reconceptualized our work to include thinking about the negotiation and the implementation of what is called the Women, Peace, and Security Agenda. Since the Holocaust, since the rapes in the Yugoslav conflict, there's been a real shift on the international level to at least recognize these issues. It was solidified in the UN Security Council Resolution 1325, and it requires that gendered violence in war and women's voices in peacemaking be taken seriously. And subsequent UN resolutions have called for countries to adopt women, peace, and security national action plans, and then to implement them throughout the country in regional plans.
So to address the second part of this question, and what we've been looking at both historically and in the current time period, is that this question of trauma. And so Jen and I believe that it was important for us to pursue this project now to support Ukraine and Ukrainians. But we had this question, how do we do research at a time of ongoing trauma? We were cautious as a historian and a political scientist that this training does not prepare us to do this trauma work. So what we decided what we could do was to examine organizational responses to the war and to the needs of refugees. So to really try to understand the structures of solidarity and support that were created to address this current trauma. And this, I think, is really an ongoing conversation that extends beyond the region, as was mentioned in the introduction, and is really at the center of our conversation. How do we as scholars work at a time of trauma and respect the needs of those in trauma, while also fulfilling a sense of responsibility to speak about the trauma to the world outside our field? So what became clear to us immediately was how trauma related to the war in Ukraine was a thread woven into the work of organizations on so many levels, on different levels. And so what I'll do in my brief time is just give you a couple of examples of where we saw people speak about this trauma on an organizational and government and individual level. So first, the reference to trauma was direct by the staff of these Latvian organizations. So, for example, we spoke with Anda Shrinka, one of the directors of Skalbis, which is a crisis center working in Riga for 20 years, speaking to helping. It's a crisis line. It's a crisis line for people dealing with individual crises, but also national crises in times of great natural disaster or there's a collapse in a building. But she said when the war broke out, or escalated, I should say, in 2022, 90% of their calls were about the war. And these calls came from Ukrainians themselves, calling from bomb shelters, calling from basements in Ukraine. So there was a direct connection and experience of this trauma through these calls. But these calls also came from Latvians in Riga who spoke about the trauma they felt themselves, about, as Shrinka put it, the feeling that they could not go on and didn't know, very uncertain for the future. And another organization we interviewed, the Marta Resource Center for Women, they immediately worked to help the refugees, but they also set aside time and staff for dealing with their own trauma. We're coming together and talking about how they were experiencing this war, not only in the sense of staff, but also as individuals living in Latvia. As you go to the government responses, the work that some of these organizations did on trauma, especially on gender trauma, also formed the foundation of, for cooperating with government organizations and helping them respond to the war. So when Russia's war on Ukraine escalated, the Marta Center started partnering with Latvian government initiatives, which included the training and supporting staff at 3 shelters in Ukraine. The first for victims of conflict-related sexual violence, or CRSV, in Western Ukraine, in the town of Ivano-Frankivsk, and the others in the region of Chernihiv, mostly at first for supporting children traumatized by the war, but now moving toward instituting programs speaking to the empowering of women, such as women teaching other women and self-defense courses. And then finally, as we mentioned, we did not, recognizing our own limitations in our own training, and this is a time of ongoing trauma, we did not set out to interview Ukrainian refugees themselves. But as in many countries helping Ukraine, it is the Ukrainian women who take on key roles in the work of refugee support. So to share one story, at the Marta Center, the support for Ukraine is being led by Natalia Chudaeva, a refugee who has been a director of the Social Services Center for Children and Family in Mariupol. And her work is driven by her own trauma of war, and this is what she started with, sharing with us as we interviewed her about her work. She had a harrowing journey to Latvia through Russia, but her work also then is built on her own feminist activism before the war. She was trained first as a midwife, and she explained that her entire life has been built in such a way that I helped women, leading her to self-identify as a feminist because she understood that her work is being focused on achieving women's independence. And her work on Ukraine's national action plan, connected to the women, peace and security that Janet mentioned, and its implementation in Ukraine, she continues to do this work remote from Latvia. She has not been back to Ukraine, although when we did speak to her in July, her plan was to return in August. And while she has also been working with the Latvian government, with the Marta Center, she also has been advising Ukraine's Ministry of Social Policy of Ukraine on the practices that her social services center had carried out in Mariupol. So the point is that, kind of bringing all this together, that through these centers of resilience and programs of resilience and response to trauma are opening across Latvia and also across Ukraine based on these types of prototypes. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all the speakers for the initial remarks. I would just like to remind those who are participating in this webinar as audience that after the initial questions that will come from me, we're going to have a question and answer session, and you can post your questions in the chat once the chat will be opened after the next 15 minutes or so. I have several questions for the panelists, and I will go in the order of presentations. Dinah, I would like to ask you to reflect a little bit on how Stalinist filtration camps, which is a euphemism for concentration camps, have been revived in today's Russia's war on Ukraine, and perhaps what that also means for women.
Thank you, Grażyna. I will try to keep this really short. So I just want to briefly draw a historical thread between my opening story and some of the events and atrocities of the ongoing war in Ukraine. So I spoke earlier of the threats to girls and women liberated from the Nazi camps from their Soviet liberators who were suspicious of them, who took their survival not as evidence of resilience or even just circumstance, but rather as some sort of evidence of complicity. This lent to, but also was just part of a kind of Stalinist post-war environment of paranoia and violence. It's something that may or may not be familiar, I think, to historians and those who are interested in the history of this period, is that many of those who sought to return to homes in Soviet territory, whether in the Baltics, Ukraine, Moldova, or such, at war's end, or sometimes just those who ended up in liberated zones, were subject to filtration. And filtration camps, it's a long story, but the short version of it is filtration camps were sites at which essentially to interrogate allegiances and loyalty to the Soviet state, and at which to demonstrate the power of the Soviet state over the lives of its citizens. Millions passed through these camps, and that included Soviet POWs, citizens who had mobilized voluntarily or involuntarily in the German army, laborers in Soviet-controlled industry, and many Jewish survivors of concentration camps. In the filtration camps, they were interrogated, sometimes sexually abused, often exploited for free labor in sectors where the Soviets needed human labor. I want to share one quick example, and then I want to shift to Ukraine. Fania Pavlova, a Latvian-born Jewish survivor, writes in her memoir that she was desperate after liberation to get home. In Warsaw, prospective returnees had to pass through a filtration checkpoint. She writes, quote, "The KGB was checking everyone who had ended up with the Germans for whatever reason. I was called several times for questioning by an investigator. They asked me everything, how I survived, why I wasn't shot, because so many Jews had been. They couldn't fathom that I, a Jewish girl, stayed alive after all those concentration camps." Suspicion followed the survivors. And something that we've seen, and this is probably something that's familiar to a lot of our listeners, is that in Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, Russia has revived this Stalinist era use of filtration to interrogate, to sort, to punish Ukrainians. This has been documented for several years, but in mid-2024, Ukraine's National Resistance Center wrote that, quote, "The Kremlin has been building a system of filtration camps since the beginning of its occupation of Ukraine. In such zones, people are tested for loyalty to occupation authorities, something which sounds very familiar. This marks just another revival of Stalinist-era atrocity in Putin's Russia, this time used by a brutal and paranoid state to uncover anyone associated with the Ukrainian army, territorial defense, government, and media. There have been many reports for men and women of physical violence, including sexual violence. Of course, in Stalin's time, some of those who underwent filtration were temporarily detained, while others were forcibly deported. Some disappeared altogether. Unfortunately, the same process continues today. So I'll keep it short, but that's the thread between the past, the unfortunate thread between the past and today.
Thank you, Dinah. As it said, history does not repeat, but it rhymes. Speaking of history rhyming and bringing it back to the present moment, Marta, I would also like you to reflect a little bit on the survivors of sexual violence in Russia's war against Ukraine. You talked about agency, about recovering agency through legal processes. Could you talk a little bit about what is happening in the present moment in the context of Russia's war against Ukraine?
Thank you so much for this question. I want to stress that many survivors of sexual violence by Russian forces and their Ukrainian proxies get substantial media attention from different political bodies. And this attention, in one hand, I believe helped many of them to understand that what happened to them is not about, it's not a private issue. It's a political violence that happened to them. It's a war crime. It's a crime against humanity. So that's why many of those women, with the state support, with the support of many feminist organizations, they came forward and they started to talk about their trauma. And not only about their experience. They became the voices of those women who were silenced by death, or who can still find a strength to come forward and speak about their traumatic experience. That's why they raised awareness in general about war-related sexual violence in Ukraine. They are cooperating with different media. They are talking openly about their trauma. They participating in different documentaries made by Ukrainian media and foreign media. They communicate with different NGO and different international organizations like Mukwege organization and Global Survivors Fund and so on and so forth. I want to stress the importance of one precise organization. It's Advancement of Ukraine that is led and created by women who survived gender-based violence in hands of Russians and their proxies. This organization was created in 2019, and the leader of this organization, Irina Dovgany, was pictured by New York Times in 2014. It's a famous iconic picture where she is publicly violated in Donetsk, in the city center, by her neighbors for alleged support of Ukraine armed forces and for traitor of Donbas people. So she survived sexual violence at hands of Vostok Battalion, and she gathered together those women, and they started not only support each other, but advocate the general cause to bring justice to those women, to work on reparation questions, and so on and so forth. But we had still many challenges. I want to stress that in Ukraine today, we have hierarchy of victims and hierarchy of perpetrators. Those who suffered sexual violence at the hand of Russians and people from so-called LNR, DNR are welcomed victims. They are celebrated victims. They gained enormous attention from Ukrainian media. They gained enormous support from Ukrainian officials and government bodies. But those who were violated in 2014, 15, 16 in the detention centers of Ukraine Security Service by members of battalions, volunteer battalions like Aidar, Azov, and Pravy sector, they are unwelcomed victims nowadays. You will never see their stories in the media, especially mainstream media. They are not invited to portray their stories for documentaries. They are not invited to include their stories in different books that now are released about the war. So among those war stories, we don't see those unwelcomed victims. So basically, nowadays, another challenge for survivors of sexual violence is to destroy this hierarchy of victims and destroy this hierarchy of perpetrators. Tornado Battalion was released, actually, those who were put on trial because of including sexual violence against civilians, nowadays are heroes. Nowadays are fighting for freedom of Ukraine. So what about justice for their victims? What about justice for those women? Ukraine is trapped in narrative about war as about rape as a weapon of war, and it creates a lot of obstacles for justice, for gender justice, and for gender equality. Because nowadays we have disproportionate attention to proper victim and silencing improper victims. And I believe these problems should be addressed and should be discussed and should be resolved. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marta. We're returning once again to the question of the violence perpetrated by liberators and the silenced victims of liberators. I know it's a hard shift, but we are shifting a little bit to more of a meta level to talk with Mara and Janet about their project, who was intended as a transnational project, working across languages, working across ethnicities. You worked with many different organizations. What was it like? What were some of the key findings of working transnationally? And what was it like, perhaps, for also between the two of you to collaborate together, coming from different backgrounds, not just in terms of discipline, but also walks of life?
Thank you. I'm struggling and thinking about what Marta just said. I think so. In many ways, what I want to say is we found remarkable transnational feminist solidarity from these Latvian organizations. There was a lot of compassion and care, but I note that it really seems to have started in 2022, and that real level of solidarity happens only in the last couple of years. There was tremendous solidarity with Ukrainians in Latvia and those in Ukraine. And I think that a lot of this came from shared experiences of Russian and Soviet imperialism. And also, there's this kind of interesting and weird phenomenon of the fact that most Latvians and Ukrainians speak Russian. So there was a pragmatic thing that facilitated their relationships, even as it was problematic for both sets of peoples. Just to give an example, Latvian-based Marta, not Marta who's here, but this organization in Latvia called Marta, was working with Ukraine's organization, Women's Information Consultative Center in Kyiv, which was in turn involved in creating a legal framework for conflict-related sexual violence, working with the UN. So here you have like this real transnational efforts. And Marta was also part of an interesting organization called the Women Peace Dialogue Network, which had also been founded by this Ukrainian organization in 2016 for the states that have been colonized by the Soviet Union to work together to have feminist conversations about peace. And then there were some other organizations that MARTA, like those kinds of so MARTA itself, which had been part of these transnational networks, continued that organizing, brought Ukrainian activists working on the Women, Peace and Security National Action Plan in Ukraine. They brought them to Latvia to see how Latvian organizations support victims of gendered violence. And they also, MARTA, the Latvian organization, helped Ukraine revise its Women, Peace and Security National Action Plan. So there's just all of these things going on that were kind of what we expected. But in other ways, there were things that we didn't see. So I'm going to turn it over to Mara.
So well, we also were surprised though to find that well-established, or at least perhaps from our external experience, well-established transnational feminist networks such as the European Network WAVE, which includes another key feminist organization that we did not talk about yet so much. That is the Latvian Women's Network, which is another, brings together many Latvian NGOs in Latvia. And the Crisis Line Skalbas, they're both a part of WAVE, but wasn't really active in fostering connections during the full-scale war. Similarly, the Droša Māja, Safe House, does not self-identify as a feminist organization, although it did then speak about its work as feminist, and has one of its most recent projects is empowering. It's called Strong Women, and focusing on empowering, educating, integrating Ukrainian women refugees. Much of it work before the war also was on concern about trafficking in persons, but it never heard of La Strada, which is a international anti-trafficking network, La Strada Ukraine. It had worked with La Strada Poland. So I mean, there were some of these moments of, I think, transnational cooperation that we thought might lead to more kind of a network, an established network. And I think and we did not find that, right? So we found more where transnationalism came into action, and the ideas of transnational solidarity were more based project by project, or moments of cooperation and knowing of each other, but not necessarily engaging in establishing a stronger network. And then there's one more example. I know we want to get to questions. Is our trying to understand the role of Russian speaking, or the Russian community, the Russian anti-war community. And as Janet mentioned, there's this question of language, that many organizations used Russian while recognizing, I think, a level of discomfort in doing so. I think I don't want to speak too much for them, or at least recognizing the history that made this possible, I should say, or the history that the shared history that unfortunately necessitates this kind of cooperation. But we also found, for example, one youth organization, Young Folk, that is largely Russian speaking, although it self-identifies as transnational, doing much feminist work, much activist work, working on the ground and helping Ukrainian refugees. It runs a store that provides like a free store for Ukrainian refugees, but really seemed to be working within its own group, within its own group, and not making that transnational network leap or network solidarity that we had been looking for. I don't know if Janet wants to make a few comments about collaboration itself.
Well, just to say, so I have been trained as a Russianist. So coming to this work and I've trained as a Russianist. I have done work across and on Eastern Europe. So it was not completely outside of my experience. But one of the things that we thought about doing this project was how to bring, we were curious about transnational relationships, and it was interesting to bring our different language skills and experiences and understandings to also think about this, to help us think about these things differently, both to, as well as to deal with the trauma of the war, and to figure out, I don't know if I can, to figure out how to do this kind of research. So, I mean, just to say that it was a tremendous help to do work together as opposed to by ourselves when we worked on both in terms of coming with different experiences, but also to support each other and thinking about the war. And definitely my relationship with Marta and other scholars who are mostly focused on countries that have been colonized by Russia and the Soviet Union was really helpful for helping me rethink the way that I understand this part of the world.
Thank you so much, Mara and Janet. Seems that we're also running into the question of imperial or colonial subjects and the way that transnational work does or does not translate them, how language works. Unfortunately, we have limited time, and right now we are moving to questions and from the audience, and I would just like to remind the audience members that we welcome the questions, and it's particularly helpful if you identify to whom you direct the question. The first question is directed to Dinah and Marta. What would you consider the most prevalent long-term effects of conflict-related sexual violence on communities or nations as a whole? Would it be helpful if I read it again? Or are we good? Yeah.
I'll start because I think Mapna has more to add from a contemporary perspective, but I mean, something that is ever significant is the fact that although this has changed now, it's still an anomaly that anyone is called to account for having committed these crimes. This is still, you know, the exception rather than the rule. And until it becomes the rule rather than the exception, I think that I mean, the trauma in this sense is inevitable. I mean, that's more thinking kind of from a broader institutional perspective rather than from a kind of community experience perspective, which is a little different from what I was talking about in my research. But I think the fact that, you know, when one looks at the Russian army as as perpetrators of this, the fact that no one was ever called to account after the war. I think in a few exceptional cases that Matna has documented in her work on Ukraine, but almost never has anyone been called to account for this. There's never been this process of, you know, neither de-Stalinization nor sort of whatever it would be that would ensure that women's voices mattered, you know, and that justice mattered. I think we're still a long way off from that. So I think that's something that is sort of one of the chronic problems. But Matna, I'll turn that over to you.
Thank you so much. As a Holocaust scholar, I listened to dozens of interviews of survivors of sexual violence. Most of those interviews were recorded 50, 60, and 40, 50, and 60 years after the end of the World War II. And what is very important to note, that some of those women still have what we can call today as PTSD, meaning intrusive thoughts, nightmares, and they you know, I even when I discussed with my students those long-term consequences, I made a precise screenshot from the interview to show them their bodily expression, their emotions, their facial expressions in times when they are talking about their trauma and what they experienced. And it's so telling when you don't develop this holistic approach to cure survivors of sexual violence, when they didn't get this substantial support, they will experience trauma for a long period of time. But not only them, It affects their family members. It affects their sexual life, their intimate life. We know that many Holocaust survivors, for example, experience problems in their marriage after the war. And I assume that their experience during the war was one of the consequences of this. What we observe nowadays in Ukraine is very similar to many different cases of genocide, ethnic conflicts, different war. Many women are in trauma, but also traumatize their children. For example, those who witness sexual violence against their mothers. They turned gray, they stopped talking, traumatized men who were forced to stand without any action, who were forced to watch humiliation of their women. So we are talking about men as so-called secondary victims of sexual violence, because it's about undermining their masculinity, which is built on the notion of defending of their children, of their daughters, of their wives. That's why we are talking about the undermine the very fabric of social structures and social and gender norms within the society. And also, one of the consequences, as I told you, will be whose pain matters, whose stories matters, who will get this support from the state, from NGOs, and who will be blamed for non-conventional stories. For example, we already saw some women blamed for prostituting themselves and using their body as a survival tool. So we still have victim blaming in our societies that is flourishing during the war. We have spreading those instructions, you know, pretend that you are sick, pretend that you have convulsions. So the byproduct of this is not only about safety. Everyone who will take this, you know, note and will ask you, did you do that? Did you do that? So maybe it's your fault, or maybe you vote for, you know, Yanukovych, other pro-Russian forces. So actually, it's also about division within the society. So the consequences could be actually catastrophic to Ukraine society in general, and to some communities in particular, and some families, not to mention survivors and their loved ones. Thank you.
Thank you, Marta. My next question is from the audience, is to Mara and Janet, but open to all. How have narrative approaches to rape, and specifically approaches to rape investigations, changed in Eastern Europe over time? So the question was directed to Mara and Janet. And then anyone can pick up on that.
I mean, I think probably Marta can speak more to this. Marta and Diana can speak more to this, because I think what that question challenges us to do, right, is to think about how do we document and listen to victims' experiences during trauma, right? And I think that is the challenge, you know, that we frankly did not hear. We did ask the organizations about explicitly, organization leaders, what had they heard about? Had they had cases of violence and gendered violence? And it was general recognition. So to say that, yes, they had heard it had existed, perhaps they had heard of an incident or two, but I think that is indicative, right, of perhaps still not having or still working through developing a system to provide this kind of support and these kinds of narratives that Marta and Diana are talking about during a time of trauma. I'll hand it over to you or to Janet. Yeah, if Marta or Diana or Janet, if you want to pick up.
Marta, I'm going to give this to you.
Yeah, thank you so much. So Actually, we observe just enormous change even within this Russian-Ukraine war from 2014 to today's day. Why? Because when the war started, actually, Ukraine officials downplayed sexual violence. They downplayed sexual violence. They didn't develop any actually programs to support survivors of sexual violence. Why? My understanding is sexual violence was widespread on both sides. That's why Ukraine government decided just to, downplay those and all those requirements. For example, they demand, for example, from survivors proofs. So, and as you know, in cases of sexual violence, especially in war-torn zones, you can have easy access to medical facilities. You don't have rape kits. Sometimes you haven't even clue to save this, to safeguard the clothes in which you wore during the rape. And many women were not aware how actually this is important for investigation. Nowadays, the whole approach changed. Nowadays, Ukraine officials, they develop mobile groups that consist of psychologists, social workers, and they understood that security first. Security first. You should evacuate person, first of all, their loved ones. You should give medical support, psychological support. You should stabilize, and then you should question, but without the pressure. Now they are very vocal official bodies about, right to be silent for survivors of sexual violence. Because, we know that sexual violence in every single war, including Russia-Ukraine war, is weaponized for political reason, for different sides, including Ukraine's side. At the beginning of the war, we know how Ukraine ombudswoman, for example, she discredited the whole cause, actually. And she was highly criticized by many people inside Ukraine, many feminist organizations, journalists, for the way how she approached and communicate the topic. And she actually gave the tool for Russian Kremlin propaganda to claim that all those stories are fake. All those stories are fake. And now, after consultations with different NGOs, UN, Ukraine government is trying to improve their behavior and to develop this and for example, they organize training for investigators. Please don't ask about past sexual history. Because it fuels victim blaming. Yes, please don't put pressure. Please be so they really changed their approaches, and I'm very happy about this. But I believe that more should be done, and the whole issue should be less politicized, yes, than it is now. But it's very difficult to actually achieve this, because those who will challenge these master political narratives and political discourse of war-related sexual violence could be threatened, could be blamed for facilitating Kremlin propaganda, could be jailed for 5 years even for justification of Russian aggression. That's why it's very difficult. And I invite you just to talk with different feminist scholars and activists privately to understand what is going on and how actually those NGOs and feminist initiatives from abroad can change the situation on the ground in Ukraine. Because some Ukrainian feminists who are obsessed with this arm Ukraine now, with this militaristic rhetoric, they forgot that, that they should advocate actually all groups of victims, even those unwelcomed. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dinah, Marta, Mara, and Janet. This has been as difficult to sit through as this has been magnetic. We have more questions from, from the audience, and I would just like to give Janet a chance to respond, and after that, we will conclude the conversation.
Thank you. I just really wanted to thank Marta for really pulling out one of these important dynamics, I think, in this conversation is the complexities of how we deal with conflict-related sexual violence. So to take the perspective of the UN Women, Peace and Security agenda, it wasn't incredibly high. Like the original 1325 resolution was really broad-based, but we have this weird relationship to sexual violence. Both the attention, there's a lot of attention in moments where we see it, but we only see some of it. We don't see others. And then there's this broader question, which I think was really helpful for me to look at when we were in Latvia, is that women need all sorts of support. Many women who were victims of sexual violence in Bosnia in the end were like, yes, this was a big thing that happened, but also our sons were murdered and we kind of care more about that. And I'm not saying that all of it is horrible. I'm not saying that we shouldn't be horrified and see conflict-related sexual violence as a war crime, but that supporting Ukrainian women is a thing that requires comprehensive care and services for a wide variety of traumas. And so, you know, again, I think that it's important to think about conflict-related gendered and sexual violence, but also when we think about these questions, as was framed in this panel, to think about questions of gender and trauma more broadly.
Thank you, Janet. Once again, thank you to all of the panel members. Ben has posted several articles on the shared chat that continue the conversation that we've started here. It is impossible to exhaust the question and conversation, especially when we look at the historical violence against women, as well as contemporary realities, and many of which we barely touched upon. I would also like to draw attention to questions of sexual violence as imperial violence, questions of sexual violence as part of the nationalist project, the way that women's stories are utilized, the way that they can become part of the predatory narratives that perpetuate further violence and political divisions, the way that women's stories of sexual violence also become exploited for many different uses and perpetuate that violence further on, including media, including publicity, and I'm going to go on a limb and say this, also including academic careers. So for those of us who were part of this, who had the privilege of listening to this, I wish us all a respectful attitude and a thoughtful engagement with what we heard. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for participating and making this happen, because these panels are impossible without the audience. I would also like to thank AABS and the wonderful team behind this panel for organizing it and holding all the different bits and pieces together. Thank you all.